Oh, thank you very much, Pavel. I think it's also a double pleasure and a double honor for me. It's part of homecoming for me. I can only regret that I can't be here in Warsaw in person today. Probably almost as much as I regret that I wasn't able to be in Warsaw yesterday in person, but that's another story. I'm delighted to be presenting at a CMR webinar, having seen the fantastic trajectory of the research center under your helm, and basically thanks to the magnificent efforts of the whole team since the times that we were both sort of presenting as early scholars and in PhD seminars and some such. So all the greater pleasure for me to be joining you and talking about indeed one of the projects that you mentioned, Pavel, which is QuantMig, which is coming to an end. And as part of this project, we've been looking at what can be said today about migration future in different time horizons. So hence the Scanning Horizons title for today's talk. And of course, this is not just my work. It's been a whole team's effort for the past almost 3.5 years, and this is something that it wouldn't be possible without really the fantastic contributions of everyone involved. So what I'd like to do today is talk a bit about. We started talking about uncertainty, and Pavel, in your introductory comments, you mentioned that quite strongly, and I'd like to start from that, from the sources of uncertainty. Where do we think the main issues about not knowing what migration future might hold are? What does it imply both for science and for policy? Again, across a range of time horizons, we'll be looking at this time element will be quite important because of the very different implications of the horizon that we'll be looking at. Then we'll have a look at some of the recent developments in terms of methods, what has been proposed to look at migration futures, and what are the limits of what we know now and what we can ever be able to learn. So these four things will then lead to some concluding remarks, both in terms of where this can go scientifically, as well as what does it mean for policy and practice. So to start with the sources of migration uncertainty. We don't really need to repeat that migration is very uncertain. It's in demography, if we're looking from the point of view of demographic processes, it's one of the most, if not the most, uncertain process. And in a way, this is now almost became a stylized fact of migration. What is interesting at the conceptual level is the different types of uncertainty and the different places in which uncertainty is lurking. And of those, sort of playing on famous Donald Rumsfeld's quote about known and unknown unknowns, what are the things that we can possibly learn about, so knowable, and what are the things that are unknowable in migration realm? And underpinning all of that, and this is something that this uncertainties can be about flows, can be about drivers or driver environments, can be about individual actors who make decisions. These decisions are also made under the conditions of uncertainty, but people who make them have agency to make them. There is the political or policy uncertainty. There is the what's called the uncertainty of governance. The responses to migration events also are made to some extent in the dark with respect to what might happen. And as a result, what we're seeing that quite often, because the policymakers don't know what might happen, they pivot to what was the current status quo, with a tendency to probably safeguard against something that they perceive as negative aspects of migration, rather than trying to take opportunities of what may be actually the more positive processes that are associated with it. So that's for starters. But what we also know quite a few things about from the literature on migration forecasting that's been around for at least through 3-4 decades now. And besides the fact that we have very high levels of uncertainty, very high levels of complexity of the processes, to the point that these processes are barely predictable, they don't have the features like stationarity, which is a statistical term for saying that the process is stable and enable us to predict it. What goes beyond that is that whenever actually we see migration predictions that look too good to be true, that's too nice, too orderly, that should raise our suspicion. Because if they look too good to be true, then they probably are. We also know that once we start disaggregating migration into sub-processes, we will get a better, clearer picture, and we may even find that some of these processes are better predictable than others. So return nationals typically exhibit much more stable patterns than, for example, asylum seekers. There is also some regularity in terms of the age profiles, in terms of the spatial profiles. So there are things that we know, but it's what we don't know is really creating quite a lot of challenge, both scientifically and in terms of policy. So what we are really struggling to get right in that respect is to try to describe this uncertainty somehow, maybe calibrate it if we want to make some statements about the probabilities of things happening in the future, but also what to do moving beyond that. So how better to prepare for the uncertain and unexpected future. And this is something that has been quite recently in the last few years has been very top of the agenda politically in terms of European policy and in many countries individually. This notion of preparedness that you should be really able to come up with solutions that policy solutions or practical solutions that enable resilience in the face of the unknown. So be prepared, right, as the Scouts motto would say. What doesn't help us is that the theoretical or explanatory background of migration, as we all well know, is fragmented and doesn't really help in making statements about the future. So we are very good at creating what sociologists would call mid-range theories about specific events, specific processes. We can identify some stylized facts of migration, although even those can be questioned, such as the relationship between migration and development, for example. And what we can also do is we can employ various tools such as computer simulations just to try to come up with possible what-if type scenarios enabling us to make statements about migration, conditional on the various things that we might want to simulate. So, for example, different policy options, different impact of different intervention on migration processes, and importantly, whether there may be any trade-offs between those and some other parts of the migration system. So even though we don't have a grand theory of migration, we have snippets of knowledge in different areas that if we are interested in something specific would be a great place to start looking for insights into the future. So going back to the question about sources of uncertainty and where are they exactly lurking. So back to this distinction between the knowable and unknowable uncertainty. So the formal terms are epistemic, is there's sort of, comes with epistemology. So something to do with knowledge, something where we can reduce the uncertainty through better knowledge, through knowing more. This is something that has to do with either, for what's going on now, with our ability to measure migration. to get the right data at the right frequency in a timely manner, and make sure that actually the data we have correspond to migration as opposed to something else like mobile phone records or social media records, right? So we have to find a way of translating that into the language of migration. But also this reducible part of uncertainties has to do with the concepts and definitions we use. We can try to zoom in on some of the more important and more relevant ones to use. We know something, and we can definitely know more about what drives migration at the individual level, what drives migration decisions, and we also have some knowledge about the complex driver environments and configurations. And you notice, I mean, what I'm trying to convey by fading the shades of gray on this slide as we go from the very short to long horizons is that actually the epistemic uncertainty is the highest and it's most important for the very short and short horizons. So anywhere between now and a few months ahead. The role of epistemic uncertainty in planning for decades ahead becomes very small. But it's precisely at those horizons that the aleatory, so the second kind, the unknowable uncertainty and irreducible uncertainty becomes dominant. And at the far end of the spectrum, so when we look at long-term horizons, decades ahead, there's this simply the very basic uncertainty of the future being open and future being largely unknown. But even at the shorter horizons, we have unpredictability of human behavior. We have the fact that there may be shocks to the migration processes and migration drivers. There may be step change in technological advances, also possibly enabling us to do more in terms of shedding light on the epistemic uncertainty. So across the different time horizons, we have to deal with different things that come into play in different proportions. So this is the first part of the challenge. And when it comes to individual decisions under uncertainty, of course, they are made for different time horizons. So if I'm making a decision whether to migrate or not, I may either have a horizon of just a few months or a few years or possibly a few decades, or in extreme cases, someone just needs to leave because of the fear of persecution or other similar circumstances. So time is very important. And of course, time comes into play in many ways. Time comes into play through the way where we are in our life course. So typically young, as we already well know, right? Young people in the 20s are more mobile than people who have teenage children, for example, in the 40s. And depending on the exact flow, I mean, some of the migrations around the retirement age can be also visibly distinct. So there are links with other things that are happening in our lives. What is also important is that, and what we are trying to convey in this graph, sort of, it's our attempt to draw a four-dimensional diagram in 2 dimensions. What is also important for the uncertainty is the fact that the decisions are made under uncertainty. So the level of information that is available to the decision makers, both migrants or potential migrants, as well as policymakers who may want to respond to migration, this level of information will be different. Sometimes the actors will have good, full, reliable information, or as full as possible. Sometimes they will have hardly any, or sometimes it will be outright misleading and leading in false directions. So that's specifically the part of uncertainty that deals with the decisions at the micro level. So what does it imply now, both for scientific advances and for policy making? So if you look at the forward-looking migration studies that have been around in the literature in the last few decades. Depending on the time horizon and depending also on the objectives of the exercise, we are talking about different things. So in the short or very short horizons, from now up to a few months ahead, we will be talking about methods like signal detection or change point detection, early warnings. And the main objective of that is to help with operational matters. This is something that anytime there is a so-called crisis, or that there is something that requires prompt response, such as has been seen after the Russian invasion of Ukraine last year, especially in February, March, April 2022, there is a very acute need for planning with as short lead-in times as possible, which is why the interest in these kind of methods, these kind of approaches has been increasing, at least since 2015, since the peak in the Mediterranean arrival of Syrian and other migrants into Southern Europe. Then from that level, we move to the next step. So if we're looking at forecasting proper with a few years horizon and typically using statistical or econometric methods, sometimes based on experts, sometimes based on surveys amongst prospective migrants, this is something that we can call it a tactical level, right? So something to do with planning. So not necessarily an immediate allocation of resources, but something that recognizes that there is a change coming, and we need to adapt to this change by making sure that we have resources available for the change to happen in the horizon of a few years. And then beyond that, we've got scenarios, the decades ahead, long-term strategic planning with typically. So far, it's been expert-based or model-based approaches with a clearly dominating expert-based type. And of course, as we go from now to long-term, uncertainty increases, right? The cone of uncertainty widens with time. So we know less and less as we go further into the future. And this goes back to the main question, why if it's so difficult, why do it? The purpose of doing this, the purpose of the exercise of looking forward into and scanning various migration horizons is actually crucial. Whether these are the short-term needs related to operations, whether these are the midterm needs related to planning, whether these are the long-term needs related to strategic policy development. Or in the long term as well, we can't really nowadays imagine population projections or forecasts without a migration component, which is another important use. But we have to realize that across these different purposes and across these different time horizons, there will be different users and there will be different agents who might require different things and might require different approaches to dealing with uncertainty of migration in those different time horizons. So this is something that based on a slide that I was showing last year at the IMISCO conference, but I just wanted to flag on that what is the current state of the art. Right? The forecasting and survey-based approaches are something that is now well established, it's well known. Also, its limitations are well known. We can forecast with these methods at least a few years ahead, but even then we have large uncertainty. We can ask prospective migrants about their plans in a survey, but then again we know that having a propensity to migrate is not the same as migrating. That it's a necessary condition but not sufficient. So these elements in the green box are something that we currently know quite a lot about how these approaches work, but also where do they, what gaps do they have? In terms of scenarios, there has been some progress, sort of starting from the typical either high baseline low or plausible, possible wildcard type scenarios. Sometimes using drivers, sometimes trying to use pathways of different trajectories of socioeconomic development. So this is where we have been seeing quite a lot of progress, but still, in terms of the construction, most of the scenarios look very similar. So you have typically 4 or sometimes a different number of trajectories going into the future, with the idea that collectively between them they attempt to chart a map of possibilities of what might happen to migration. And then at the other end of the scale, we've got the very strong focus of current research, which is on early warnings, change point detection, and what comes with the various new data sources, such as digital traces, mobile phone data, and similar. So that was the science. But what about policy? Well, there has been, especially again since 2015, 2016, there has been at the European level a very significant, very visible movement towards preparedness. And this is something that culminated in terms of legislation in late 2020 with the adoption of the recommendation on an EU mechanism for preparedness and management of crisis related to migration. Note the language. This is a very sort of specific viewpoint implied by this legislation. But what we have in it as a very crucial part of the description of what this is going to be about, how this preparedness mechanism should work, how can we ensure that the EU and the member states are better prepared for any migration events that may happen in the future. This is very clearly laid out. The objective is to support a more coordinated use of what is already there by developing, amongst other things, developing an early warning forecasting system at the EU level. So the idea is that what we can have is the member states can be doing their own things already, but there is a need for coordination, and there is a need for developing something that would aid the member states, and this something can be happening at the EU level. And this is the subtext to that is that this is supposed to be supporting the development of the necessary resilience in member states to efficiently deal with any type of migration crisis. And this is where this is the way in which quite a lot of the contemporary policy interest in forecasting or early warnings has been formalized. So what we have, and migration is still by and large the prerogative of member states rather than of the European Union, if you look at this from the point of view of who is responsible for that. But at the same time, there is an attempt to at least help the process, recognizing that there is a demand across Europe, and not only across Europe, but in this case, we're talking about the European Union. There is demand for forward-looking studies. But how this has been looking like in practice? So when we looked in Quantum, when we looked at the changes to migration policy in response to various events, I mean, the stylized image of that you can see on the slide. So basically, there was an increasingly more activity in terms of migration and migration-related policy, but the magnitude of changes that have been implemented through the various measures has been decreasing. So in a sense, we've especially the previous decade, or previous 2 decades, since the beginning of the 21st century, we were talking about more and more small tweaks to policies. And this was largely driven by policies responding to current events, responding to also to the media portrayal of the current events, rather than taking a longer perspective and allowing the policymakers the comfort of going in a few decades into the future with long-term horizons in mind. So that's how uncertainty has been impacting policy so far. What has been the response in terms of methods? Well, to start with, when it comes to data and measurement, there is a very strong realization now that there is no single data source on migration that is sufficient to measure the processes that we are observing, be it in Europe or anywhere else. In Europe, there has been another legislation on asylum and migration statistics, which led to the improvement of the way in which migration migration measures can be compared between countries, but this came at a cost of availability. So the data that are available are better comparable between countries. So, for example, they conform to the same definition of 12-month stay of someone who needs to sort of stay for long enough to be qualified as a migrant. But then some countries stopped supplying data to Eurostat and hence reduced the availability of data for analytical purposes and also for potentially for policy making. What we did in Quantum was to actually extend the previous work of a project called IMEM, Integrated Model of European Migration, and to produce estimates of migration within Europe and into and out of Europe for 8 other regions of the world, together with measures of uncertainty and examples of which you have here on the slide. These estimates, we're doing sort of the final implementation of the online tool, which will enable everybody to freely download and analyze these estimates, and we expect this to be made available later this month. So watch this space. And in terms of predictions, what we've also found when looking at the different methods for different horizons is that not only is the predictability of migration limited, but also the methods and the performance of the various methods can be very sensitive to not only to the assumptions, but also to how we define things. So if you look at early warnings, approaches that are typically intended to trigger some warnings whenever we expect some change in migration process to be happening soon. Our own analysis identified that the potential for using both traditional data and new data combined. So we are talking about Google Trends or global GDEL, so global database of events, language, and tone, scraped from the news outlets across the web, but ideally coupled with traditional high-frequency data such as exchange rates, for example. And this is something that worked well in terms of the predictive capability of successive migration waves during the Syrian civil war. But also, here we come back to this high sensitivity. This was very sensitive to how we defined what is an event of interest, right? What is a quote-unquote crisis that we are trying to predict? What is it that's supposed to be triggering a warning, an early warning? And with forecasts, as we said before, typically they have a horizon of a few years ahead, not more. And what we can also do to help that is to use some theoretical models for stress testing policies, as is already done in central banking. So macroeconomic policy is helped and aided by the presence of various quite complicated and large models which are designed to try to test the sensitivity of the policies and different outcomes to changes in the parameters. Again, something like that is possible for migration. it won't be necessarily a forecast, but it will be a future-looking exercise that will be aimed at least making some statements about the possible drawbacks and advantages of various policy solutions. When it is, so this is going back to the early warning. Sometimes the signal can be already included in the data that we are looking at. So if we're looking, say, at asylum applications, as in this example, paper that we published with Joasia Napierała and others last year, we can detect some changes in the underlying trends through quite simple statistical methods that enable us to see changes in patterns in near real time as they develop. And of course, the more information we can find in other sources of data, in new data of various types, the more, as economists would call it, leading indicators, so the indicators that happen earlier, that we can identify, the better such methods would be. But still, first, the application would be very limited. So we're really talking about things that are happening now or have already happened. So what we are trying to do is to try to bring the horizon a bit closer to us in order to be better prepared. But also, and here is a crucial limitation of that we need to know where to look. Right, so it's all good to look exposed at what was happening in Syria or in Ukraine and see, okay, these are the variables that might have helped us predict the events and the migration that followed. But at the same time, to be able to say that in advance of an event happening, you need to know where to look. So these models can't exist in isolation. They have to be coupled with other tools. Intelligence information, including, of course, classified at the government level. So this is something that in order to work properly would need quite strong additional expert input in the right places. And so speaking about Ukraine, what could have been predicted? So what we looked at a very large range of indicators, these leading indicators for asylum-related migration, with a view of whether there could be any early warning of things going for the worse, and actually found that there are some variables that can be helpful. Again, as leading indicators, so as indicators giving us at least a month or maybe a couple of months ahead information about things going for the worse. So here is an example of a score that measures the tone of media narrative regarding events, in this case in Ukraine. So you can clearly see things coinciding with first the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and then events leading up to the full-scale invasion in February 2022. Again, these results are very tentative. More of this we will be showing at IMISCO next month, for those of you who will be attending and would like to find out more details about this and the Syrian case study. But going sort of all the way to the other end of the temporal spectrum, so to long-term horizons. When we talk about scenarios, especially those sort of exploratory scenarios of the futures, when we try to ask ourselves the question, where is their uncertainty hidden? How is it represented? How is it portrayed to the users? The main lesson from reviewing the available literature is that really very rarely is this uncertainty quantified in any formal way. Of course, there's a reason for that. The sources of uncertainty are very difficult to include in scenarios. But at the same time, for scenarios, we need to ask ourselves a question, does it really matter? If the aim is planning, if the aim is sort of strategic level planning, do we really need to know about all the different possible sources of uncertainty? Or is it enough to know that things happen and things of different magnitude can happen at different time frequencies? again, this is something that is not unheard of. It's something that's been used in civil contingencies. The idea being that, as in civil contingencies, there is also a discourse around preparedness for events of different magnitudes, such as earthquakes or floods or rainfall, once in a decade, twice in a century type events. There may be some similarities for migration planning and preparedness that we could be looking at, and indeed we have been exploring that in the context of scenarios in a report that is coming up also later this month as part of the final push to get the quantumic results out into the public domain. So again, watch this space. So where we are, what do we know? What are the current limits of our knowledge? So again, throughout the quantumic work, we've been looking at drivers. We've been looking at not only sources of uncertainty, but how they interact with the places of origin, places of destination. And there were quite a few quite interesting insights from this analysis. So first of all, the work we did confirmed the fact that what are the so-called root causes of migration? They're really the root causes of aspirations to migrate rather than migration itself. And aspirations seems to be this sort of key mediating variable between a lot of the drivers, a lot of the root causes, and migration as it happens. And of course, not surprisingly, policies come into the mix. The changes in policies and changes in any other type of interacting driver environments, they do alter the numbers, they do alter the trends, they do alter the geographic patterns and composition. So you can have the dominant composition, I mean migration by type or by sort of intended purpose, right? Some education, labor, family reunion, asylum, or combinations thereof. And there has been quite rightly a recent focus, specifically in the context of environment and violent conflict, but also this is something that extends beyond those applications. Focus on immobility, on the role of geographic proximity and duration. And there's quite a lot that we don't yet know, but this is an area where there are quite a few empirical and theoretical advances being made now. When it comes to destinations, again, uncertainty comes into play through policy. So policy uncertainty does impact migration, and so do, of course, attitudes, so do policies themselves. To illustrate this, we looked at Brexit as a case study of a political environment that was for a long time uncertain, and how it did impact migration flows into the UK, but also to other European countries. We did examine networks, and especially in the context of asylum migration, when it comes to the choice of a destination, the presence of existing networks was found to be quite strong, or even very strong, the strongest amongst the factors that we looked at. So again, confirming that not surprisingly, when we have uncertain environment with changing circumstances, the migrant destination and pathways will respond to that. And the same holds for onward migration. There is something that we know about the recent migration within Europe, partly being circular, partly settlement. An interesting thing came out as a role of Southern Europe as a transit hub for onward migration for people coming from the Middle East and North Africa, some of them through the Mediterranean. The Southern European countries being used as both transit hubs as well as destinations, but these were all the processes that can change very rapidly. So all these flows have been characterized by quite a high volatility. So how does it play to scenarios? Again, more of it will come next month when we'll be talking at EMISCO in Warsaw. But confirming what has been known about migration and the impact of migration on, especially on population and labor force, we found that no matter how we try to stretch the realms of the plausible in terms of the future migration events, even high migration events do not substantially alter the underlying demographic dynamics. So do not change the fact that populations age, migrants themselves age, labor force does age. Migration can prevent population and labor force from declining, but doesn't really change the fact that is becoming older as we live longer in countries like EU member states. So the lesson from that is that long-term impact of even high migration events is quite limited. And I said, if more details will be presented by Michaela Potomczakova at IMISCO next month. So what are the considerations here? The key considerations, the key questions that we need to ask ourselves whenever we are attempting to have any forward-looking migration study. What's the purpose? What's the object? What's crucially the time horizon of what we're trying to achieve? Because when we look across the different time horizons, different uncertainty will come into play in different proportions, and any attempt to precisely predict the future is simply futile. But it's not only that. The problem is that the trying to be overconfident in any future predictions can spectacularly backfire. So that brings me to the conclusions. Migration is uncertain. There is a very large unknowable part of this uncertainty, especially in the long run. Whatever we can try to use to model that has very clear limits. So we need to try to come up with scenarios, with ways of stress testing the different migration futures and policy solutions. But we also, whenever we have the user in mind, we need to manage their expectations. Some uncertainty is just there, and it's a fact of life, and we have to live with it. What are the lessons for horizon scanning here? So ignoring uncertainty, something that's sort of reminiscent of the 19th century determinism, it's not going to work, right? It can bring about, the only thing it can bring about is illusion of control, which again can backfire quite badly. Ignoring complexity, so the fact that actually migration is full of interrelated webs of drivers, factors, actors, and so on, can lead to proposing simple solutions that can be, the only thing that can be foreseen about those is that they won't work and that they will cause unintended consequences somewhere else. Still, we still have the reactive, I mean, by we, I'm saying sort of Western societies and policymakers, we still tend to have a rather reactive than proactive perspective on migration, despite some of the changes as in the EU blueprint, which attempts to be it's a first serious attempt to be more future oriented. And what can help this shifting perspective is the further development of the tools, but also the way in which the tools and the results of applying those tools to migration phenomena and processes are communicated to the users. So the tools can be complex, but the communication has to be simple, not simplistic, but simple enough in order to get across. So when we move from horizon scanning to preparedness, there are open questions. What can be foreseen? In what time horizons? What can we reduce through better knowledge? And if we cannot reduce the uncertainty, how to increase preparedness? We ended up the project with a listing of a few recommendations, and I'd like to sort of list them here before the discussion. The first recommendation we would like to make is that actually, whenever we talk about strategic policies that have a migration component to them, that shouldn't be a focus on numbers. Where numbers matter is the operational response, and this is because numbers mean resources, right? So whenever there is a need for, say, rapid humanitarian or other response in the area of migration, then numbers matter, and allowing for uncertainty matters a lot. But at the strategic level, this is much less important. Moreover, that there is this realization that we came to by looking at across also the sort of uncertainty policy nexus, that migration policies really should be a means to an end rather than chasing specific targets, and really not chasing headlines, not chasing today's events, but being more about the purpose of policy design. And the final idea is that whenever we talk about policies and operational procedures to do with an attempt to manage migration to the extent it's doable, then how about thinking about mechanisms to make it a bit more, how the jargon goes, future-proof? So to try to build in elements that will have constant updates, possibly of the policy tools, of the operational tools, to enable the policymakers and the users to periodically come back to these tools and see whether they are still fit for purpose. So with it, I would like to thank you very much for your patience. I think I have slightly overrun, but hopefully not by much. If you'd like to find out more, it will be coming up soon in what the sort of final summary product of the Quantnik project, which will be called the White Paper on Migration Uncertainty, coming up again either this month or early July. So thank you very much once again. It was great to be able to talk to you.
Thank you, Kuba. It was just a really excellent overview of risks, challenges, but also opportunities as related to analyzing migration in various time horizons. And I'm absolutely sure you incentivize us also to look into the papers. I have to say that this is happening in real time, really, because during your talk, I just received information on policy brief number 39 of Population Europe, and this is just about high migration events and future labor force in Europe. So exactly, this is happening here now. And now we have still some space for questions and then your answers. So feel free to indicate if you like to answer, to ask question. There is nothing on the chat, so please raise your hands if you like to ask a question, or simply unmute yourself. I guess we'll just collect a few questions. Okay. Anyone? Okay, so I'll just start with mine. I have few questions, in fact, so I'll probably limit myself to three or four. The first question is somehow related to theories, because at some point you said that, of course, we lack kind of grand theory, that could overarching theory or framework just to explain all forms, all kinds of migration. And unfortunately, it's not helpful. But my impression is, I'm not sure if you agree with. My impression is that the problem is that the current research on migration becomes more and more often atheoretical. So it's largely data-driven. And I guess it brings additional uncertainty into the process, because we are just following various migratory stories with, in fact, lack of theoretical instrumentarium just to deal with the story. So just sort of maybe comment and not the question. The second point is just about 2 points there about policies. And I guess you somehow commented on this in the final part of the presentation. My question is, what do you think, to what extent policies, and particularly long-term strategies, to what extent are the source of uncertainty, or can just mitigate risk on uncertainties? And here I'm talking not only about migration-related policies, but I don't know, common agriculture policy, trade policies, and this kind of stuff. The next point related to this one, you mentioned the operational responses as quite important also in terms of data needs and data management. But do you think that policymakers really use the data, particularly the early warning models? I'm just asking. I don't know if they really use the data. And my final case is just about Ukraine. So probably we'll present more during also IMISCO conference. But the question is, to what extent do you think that this is exceptional or just typical case? I mean, exceptional in terms of access to data, legal solutions implied, but also in terms of digitalization of the process, particularly on the side of war refugees and migrants. So I can stop here, and I would just ask all other participants to raise your hand, or you like to answer right now, or I see Anya.
As you wish.
Anya has a question, probably.
Yeah, I have one question, if I may. Well, you talked about merging various data sources, the traditional ones with the social media and mobile phones, etc. And I was wondering whether, well, in your opinion, the social media data includes more relevant information than noise, because obviously the social media, it has, well, there are a lot of assumptions, things that we don't know, things change, social media policies change, and that just throws up, well, the definitions change and we don't know it. So I was wondering what's your opinion on that.
So I guess you can just start answering.
Can I
have a second?
Yeah. Can I start by answering Anya's questions? In a sense, I think I might have not said as strongly as I would have wanted. I don't think that the social media and the new data sources on their own will tell us really useful things. In order to be able to say something useful, we'll need to benchmark them to something that we know more about, which is why sort of I'm becoming more and more, the more I look at this, the more and more I'm becoming convinced that we ideally we'd like to juxtapose the new sources of data with those such as surveys, such as registers, where we actually know the meaning of the numbers. Because as you rightly said, I mean, for social media, we don't know what these data actually represent, besides the fact that they are some digital traces of someone's tweets or someone's Facebook activity or something else. And and we can argue about definitions, and we can look at different definitions of migrants and so on. But at least with traditional sources, we can have an attempt at benchmarking everything to whatever definition we agree, or whatever set of definitions we agree. With social media on their own, we don't have that. Plus, there is something that are very interesting problems that came out from the work of my PhD student, Francesco Rampazzo. He discovered by looking at Facebook, for example, that there were periodic changes in the algorithm that were completely unannounced, completely unclear to the outside world that they were going on. Yet you could see them by jumps up and down in the trends and you could be pretty sure that they can't be explained by anything that's happening in the real world, just by the fact how the data are collected. So there's a lot of enthusiasm, and I think what do these data bring to the table is timeliness, right? Time granularity. That's absolutely, they're second to none with that. But still,
yes. But then you
right?
see this rapid rise in something or rapid drop in something. But as you said, it might be a change of algorithm, so it's very timely. But at the same time, it might be totally misleading, because we were used to this showing something, and then it's a. So that was my question: whether you feel that the merging it with the traditional data sources allows us to overcome this noise or not.
To some extent, I mean, to some extent, yes, but not all of it. The price to pay will be the error, right? We will pay the price in higher uncertainty of what we come up with. But I think whether this is the price worth paying for timeliness, I think in some contexts, yes. I mean, the Ukraine example that Pavel mentioned is quite striking. How much do we know thanks to advances in digitalization? How much more than was the case even for Syria 7 years prior? So to that end, yes, I think that there is a huge potential. But I think, you know, sort of I'm an optimistic skeptic here. I think I'm optimistic in terms of the potential of these data, but the skeptical part of me keeps nagging about potential problems, which are, yeah, as you say, you know, they're real and they have to be treated seriously.
So are you continuing?
Is it okay to go with another question?
Yeah.
Okay. Absolutely.
Thank you for this fascinating talk. I actually wanted to follow up on the previous question about the big data and to what extent and what do you include in your modeling. There is I think especially in the US right now, there is a big interest in using this big data, and I know that UNHCR matched with Georgetown University to start like a huge big data project where they use, I think, for the for predicting migration trends, but also learning backwards in using, I think, Google Trends searches as related to Ukraine, and then I think Twitter and other sources for the modeling the Venezuelan migration, and they combine it with what UNHCR collects anyway. So what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts about that, and what kind of I don't know, what kind of big data are you including in the analysis?
I think in a way, it's a similar answer to the previous one, because I'm aware of this work, and the nice thing about it is that they do not use big data in isolation, right? They do cross match it with the UNHCR records, because in a way some of the categories of migration or migrants are defined by the data, right? Whoever is acknowledged to be a refugee under the UNHCR terms is a refugee, right? And so there is a bit of a circular argument here, but in terms of the data sources we were using, we were indeed using Google Trends, although on their own they weren't as predictive as we would have hoped. We were using GDELT, which is, I mean, I think it's quite a versatile tool, and it's something that's that sort of bridges between the big data and qualitative data, quantified qualitative data, because it's all about scraping media content and trying to apply tools like sentiment analysis to attach a number, a score to the tone, whether the tone is positive or negative, and use that as a proxy for potential predictor variable for something coming up. So it's a massive project, and it's a massive database. So I think when we were downloading this for the Ukrainian and Syrian case studies, it's still sort of gigabytes of data, even though we restricted ourselves to very specific events. But yes, I think, you know, there's definitely some mileage in that, with all the caveats that we've just mentioned. Right?
Thank you.
So any other questions?
I can go back to yours, Pavel.
Yeah, of course.
So I think going backwards, because we started talking about the digital, and in the context of Ukraine, is it exceptional? I think in a way, yes, but maybe I probably think of it as a new norm, you know, the digitalization and the access to information in sort of much closer to real time probably will be staying. It is certainly exceptional, and it has been exceptional in terms of policy response. You know, the triggering of the temporary protection directive, like 2 weeks into the invasion, was just stunning. I personally, I didn't think this would happen, and yet it happened. So and this is to the huge credit of the European structures. In terms and what follows from that is, of course, the rest. So legal rights, access to labor markets, access to everything. But it also shows something interesting, that Europe could absorb a few million of people without too much of a disruption to the labor markets. This was something that was also, I think, there isn't much of it yet in the discourse, I think, but there is something that I think migration scholars will need to make more of in the coming years, because it was the scale was without precedent. The intensity, especially in February, not February, in March, in early March 2022, the intensity of migration from Ukraine was without precedent. I mean, we are talking about 200,000 crossings daily at the peak. So this is something that really, probably the previous time it happened was around 1945. But this is so the scale, the intensity, absolutely yes. There may be some interesting lessons, from the fact that the temporary protection directive was triggered. Rights were awarded to people who had to leave Ukraine. Access to labor market, legal rights, at least temporarily, with a possibility of extension. And nothing bad happened in the receiving country. So there's quite an interesting follow-up from that possible. And this sort of also nicely links with your other questions about policies, long-term policies. Are they sources of uncertainty, or can they provide opportunities? I think both. It probably depends on a policy in question. If you have policies that, for example, policies that like the temporary protection directive, it's the kind of tool that gives certainty to people, that they can come, go, they have rights, at least for a period of time. So creates channels, legal channels. There is no question of irregularity, right? And there's quite a lot of benefits from that point of view. Whereas if you have a very restrictive policy, hardly any legal channels available to people, it will be, what Matthias Czajka dubbed the deflection into irregularity. And that increases uncertainty massively, because with irregularity comes the fact that the process is much more volatile than the legal or regular flows. Your other question was about the operational level. Do policymakers use them? I think it's like the question whether we were talking about the policymakers, or rather the sort of civil servants in both in European structures, in national structures. I would say that probably the latter do quite a lot.
But they meant policymakers, yeah. Yes,
if you meant policymakers, then yes, I think that there's still probably a gap. But at the same time, there is a political will to establish institutions such as EU Asylum Agency, right, EASO previously, which has a very clear mandate in terms of sort of operational response and preparedness. Frontex has elements of that. So I think that there is a recognition that there has to be something, but it's probably still, that there's still a need to make one further leap in order to embrace it more fully. You've noticed that I left them the most difficult question last, about theories. I think I would probably partially agree with you. I think what I probably should have said is that the atheoretical approaches can work better if we just look at the predictive performance at the expense of everything else, because we don't have to. As I don't know, if you are trying to build a predictive model using information from theories, the theory itself is uncertain, the different predictors you will be using are uncertain, so you'll be just compounding uncertainty in the outcome. So for those purposes, an atheoretical approach may be better. But at the same time, I think you're absolutely right. There are regularities. And in a sense, this is the point we are trying to make about this epistemic uncertainty, right? What can we know? What are the things that we know that we can actually use as a backbone for our for making future-oriented statements? I think, and we shouldn't dismiss them, right? We know about space, we know about age, we know about some other regularities. So yes, let's use it when we can.
Thanks. Any other questions? Otherwise, I still have one more. I don't see. So I will just ask, just a very, very quick one. Because I see a paradox here, and this is here I refer to what you just said, and also to probably Anya's question. Because I fully agree that what we would like to see, would like to use, let's say, this big data, the new data, and to merge them with already existing data, just to get the proper, let's say, true picture. But the story is for me that, in fact, this is why we need those big data. As you know, to have, for example, to use the data if we don't have access to the proper, good quality data. So my question is, do you think that in a near future, we will be able just to use, for example, sentiment analysis as a sort of standalone assessment, or definitely not?
I think cautiously, probably yes. I think at least some elements. I guess it probably what is also important is transparency. I mean, part of the problem with social media et al. Is that the algorithms are hidden from public view, right? So yeah. You don't really know what's going on there, and you don't know who is being classified by the algorithm as a migrant, for example. But with other, I think, sentiment analysis, the databases like GDAT are well documented. So in principle, you can get to the bottom of it, and you can examine the not only the variables, the processes, the models that have been leading into the development of particular indicators. So I think I would say, there is certainly a potential for that, but I think I would see open. So I think it sort of becomes a plea for open science, really. I would see that they need to be open and transparent in what is being done, and I think with that,
the
I think
it's not about open science, but it should be open business if we speak about meta or I don't know, something else.
Yeah, and yes, and in a way, we've been for a long time we've been talking about migration data, how migration data are political and social constructs, but likewise, big data and including big migration data are commercial constructs. So they are not collected for the purpose of counting migrants, but they are collected for the purpose of selling, advertisements and other things. So there is still the question of repurposing the data. If you have openness and transparency, it's probably easier because you at least know conceptually what you're dealing with, right? That's probably the point I'm trying to make.
That's right. Anya, do you have additional question or comment?
No. I was just listening.
So if there is no one more to go, so big thanks to you, Kuba, for your excellent talk and discussion, and we see each other in just one time.
Yes, thank you very much. In Warsaw, thank you very much, Paweł, and Marta and Anya and others. Thanks for having me, and good luck with the organization of the conference. See you in July.
Thanks a lot, and we owe you an applause, at least in a virtual form. So Thanks a lot one more time, and thank you to all of you. I'm just stopping the recording.